Hello and welcome to Drunk on Tea. With the third season of Blood Bowl out, it seemed like a perfect time to return to the gridiron for one of the best games GW make. Today I'm going to paint one of the Bretonnian linemen from the new starter set. These great looking models are full of character, and I'm really looking forward to getting them onto the pitch and cause some carnage. The first thing I've done is prime the model black, as this will give a nice smooth undercoat for the rest of my colours to work from. The first paint I'm coming in with is Mephiston red, and with this I'm going to paint half the uniform. I'm painting a vertical line down the centre of the uniform, keeping this as straight as I can. Bretonnians often have two colours on their tunics, and the Blood Bowl team are no different. By painting the line down the middle, it gives me a nice mark to paint everything on one side of, with Mephiston red. I'm also painting a line down the centre of the back of the model as well. There is less fabric here, but I still want to keep that dividing line clear. Now I'm just painting the rest of this half of the uniform with a couple of layers of Mephiston red, until I get a nice solid coat. I'm trying to be careful around the other details that I don't want to be red, but if I do make any mistakes, they can easily be tidied up later. I'm also going to paint half of this knee pad as well. It will tie the pad into the uniform and add some interest to the lower half of the model. I'm keeping the line in the middle nice and straight and just painting one half of the knee pad red. I'm doing the same with the shield on the back as well. This is where a player number can be added later. I'm making sure the line in the middle is nice and straight, and then painting one half to have a solid coat of red all over. It may take a couple of coats until the red is solid, but in a few thin layers I should be able to build up to a nice solid coat. With the red painted is added some colour to one half of the uniform, so now I'm going to paint the other half. For this I'm using Corvus black, and I'm painting the other half of the uniform. I'm starting from the line I painted with the red, so I keep that line nice and straight. It may seem strange to paint black over a black primer, but Corvus black is a lighter shade than the black primer, and it will allow me to apply a shade to bring out the definition, and the highlights won't appear quite as stark as if I'd applied them over a darker black. I'm catching all of the other half of the uniform with Corvus black. I'm also painting the shorts with Corvus black as well. These could be painted as another two colours, but I find that the black shorts work well with these minis. I'm also making sure I paint that other half of the knee pad, catching the other half with Corvus black. Finally, I'm doing the same with the shield, catching the other half with Corvus black, making sure to keep a straight line between the Corvus black and Mephiston red. With the uniform painted, the next thing I'm going to paint is the skin. For this I'm using Cadian flesh tone, and I'm going to paint all of the areas of exposed skin. There isn't a lot of skin on this model, but I'm picking out the face with a couple of layers of Cadian flesh tone. I'm also catching any skin that's showing on the arms, like near the gloves, or any on the legs. With the skin painted, the lineman is starting to come together already. Now with some Mournfang brown, I'm going to paint all of the leather details. There is quite a lot of leather on this model, so I'm painting areas like this around his neck. I'm being careful when I get near areas I've already painted, so I don't want to accidentally paint these with Mournfang brown. I'm using Mournfang brown for this leather as it's a slightly brighter colour than I would normally paint my leather details. I find the brighter colours work well for Blood Bowl, but if you want a darker look, something like Rhinox hide works for the leather details as well. I'm also painting the boots as well. If you want to paint these with different browns to create more variation on the model, you can, but I find the Mournfang brown gives a nice light brown colour against the darker red and black uniform. With all of the leather details painted, the next step will be to paint the socks. and for this I'm using Celestra Grey. I'm just carefully picking out the socks. Socks are a regulation in the rules of Blood Bowl, so I'm going to make these stand out as white. If you wanted, you could paint them in the uniform colours, but I quite like the look of bright white socks poking out on the models. I'm being careful around the boots, but I'm making sure I paint the socks with some Celestra Grey. With the socks painted, adding another pop of colour, I'm going to paint the hair. For the hair I'm using Avalon Sunset, and I'm applying a couple of coats all over the hair. This is going to give this Bretonnian some blonde hair. It's good to mix the hair up amongst your team players to add some variation amongst the models. I'm also painting the beard here with some Avalon Sunset as well. And with the hair painted, there are only a couple of details left to base coat on this mini. With some lead belcher, I'm going to paint the metal details. I'm painting the shoulder pads and the remaining knee pad, being careful around the other details I've already painted, matching these with a coat of lead belcher. I'm also painting the fleur-de-lis on the knuckles as well. I'm carefully picking out all of the buckles on the model. I'm being careful to avoid painting over the belt, but I'm carefully picking out the buckles on this model. I'm also going to paint the rim to the shield. Some of the other models have different details on, so make sure you check all over the mini and pick out any metal details with a layer of lead belcher. And with all of the silver details painted, the last thing to paint are the gold details. And for this I'm using Retributor armour, and I'm picking out any trinkets on the model, like this one here, and any others that are on the model. Some of this team have quite a few trinkets on them. Finally, I'm also picking out the catch on the bag with some gold as well. With the gold painted, that is all of the base coats on this model, so now it's time to apply some shades. The first shade I'm applying is Reichland Flesh Shade, which I'm applying all over the skin and the hair. This will sink into the recesses and add some definition, while also darkening down the skin and hair slightly. I'm also applying the shade to any exposed skin on the arms and the legs. Now with Agrax Earthshade, I'm applying this to all of the areas I base coated with Mournfang Brown and Retributor armour. This shade will add some definition to these areas and add interest to the model. I'm making sure that the shade doesn't pull too heavily in any of the recesses. If it does start to pull, just wick it away with a dry brush. Finally, with some Known Oil, I'm going to shade everything else. For this, I'm shading all the areas I paint with lead belcher, as well as all over the uniform. I'm also catching the shorts and the socks, and all the other details we painted. If you're enjoying the video, please press like. If you want more videos, press the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And if you'd like to support the channel, please become a member by pressing the join button down below or joining me over on Patreon. When the shades have dried, you can see they've added definition all over the mini, so now it's time to apply some highlights. First, with some Cadian Flesh Tone again, I'm going to highlight the skin. I'm applying this in all of the areas that the shade didn't settle. Wherever the shade has settled in a recess, I'm leaving the shade and applying some Cadian Flesh Tone to the flat and raised areas to brighten them back up again. I'm focusing this onto areas like the nose, eyebrows and cheeks, but making sure that I leave that shade in all of those recesses. By keeping the paint thin and working in a thin layer, I'm keeping that definition from the shade and adding a small highlight to the raised details. On the arms and legs, I'm applying the Cadian Flesh Tone to areas that the shade didn't settle, or just large flat areas in the middle of the skin to keep that definition we got from the shade. And with the Acadian flesh tone applied, it's brightened up the skin. So now with some Kislev flesh, I'm applying a highlight to the most prominent features. Areas like the eyebrows, cheeks, tip of the nose, and just applying a small highlight of Kislev flesh to the most raised details. This highlight works really well on the most raised areas to add a bit more definition, especially if it's applied in small lines and spots, just at the sharpest areas. I'm also applying a small highlight to the arms in the middle of the areas I applied the Acadian flesh tone to brighten up these areas slightly. And with the Kislev flesh applied, that is the skin highlighted. So next, I'm going to highlight the hair. For this, I'm using Avalan Sunset again. I'm picking out the strands of hair with a thin highlight of Avalan Sunset. I'm just applying small lines so I leave the shade in the recesses, and I'm painting the raised details to brighten them back up. For areas without any hair sculpted, I'm quickly flicking the brush to add lines and give the impression of hair on the model. I'm also picking out the hair on the beard as well, with some Avalan Sunset. With the hair and skin highlighted, the model has some personality. So next I'm going to highlight the uniform. Starting with Mephiston Red again, I'm applying this to all the areas that the shade didn't settle on the red half of the uniform. I'm leaving that known oil in the recesses and applying some Mephiston Red to all of the raised and flat areas of the uniform to bring it back to its brighter colour. By leaving the shade in the recesses and brightening up the raised areas, I can get a nice transition to my brightest highlights on the fabric. I'm making sure I catch all of the sharpest folds and creases on the uniform, as well as any large flat areas to bring these areas back to their brighter red. For the lower part of the uniform, I'm making sure the shade stays between all of the details, but bringing all of the other areas that the shade didn't settle back up to a brighter colour with a thin layer of Mephiston Red. With the Mephiston Red applied, it's brightened up the uniform. Now with some Evil Sun Scarlet, I'm applying an edge highlight to all of the sharp and raised details on the uniform. I'm applying this as a slightly chunky highlight so I can come in with another colour next and really catch some of these areas. I'm catching all of the edges and creases with a highlight to brighten them up. This will work as a great mid-colour between the Mephiston Red and my brightest highlight, giving a nice transition between the colours. I'm making sure to catch all of the folds of the fabric with a highlight, using the tip of my brush to keep the lines nice and even as I pick out all of the raised details. At the bottom of the uniform, I'm applying this as a highlight around the edges of all of the details, making sure they are just large enough to add another colour in during the next step. I'm also applying a highlight around the edge of the knee pad, also making sure I can apply another highlight inside this one later. With the Evil Sun Scarlet applied, it's brightened up the edges to the red of the uniform. Now with some Wild Rider Red, I'm applying that final highlight. With this, I'm picking some of the sharpest points to the uniform and adding a small highlight of Wild Rider Red. I don't want to apply a full highlight all over it, or it would be too bright, but picking some of the sharpest creases and corners and applying a small spot highlight of Wild Rider Red will add that extra definition to the uniform. So I'm picking a few at the sharpest point to the uniform and adding a small spot highlight of Wild Rider Red. I'm focusing this onto areas like corners and just picking them out and brightening them up with some Wild Rider Red. On the knee pad, I'm going all the way around the red half, leaving a little bit of the previous highlight showing. With the red half of the uniform highlighted, I'm now going to do the same with the black half. Starting with Eshen Grey, I'm applying this as an edge highlight to all of the raised details on the black half of the uniform. The Eshen Grey works well with Corvus Black as a base coat to add a subtle highlight to all of the black details so they stand out, but without being too bright as to make the uniform look grey. I'm picking out all of the details on this half of the uniform making sure I'm just using the tip of my brush so I maintain a nice even highlight on all of the details. There are quite a few creases and edges to catch, so it's worth taking the time to make sure they're all highlighted, adding definition to the uniform. I'm also catching the black half of the knee pad with Eshen Grey as well. With the Eshen Grey applied, it's added definition to all of those black details. So now with some Mechanica Standard Grey, I'm going to add a smaller highlight within the Eshen Grey we just applied. I'm keeping this highlight as fine as I can, as I don't want to paint over all of the Eshen Grey. I just want to catch the very edges of details and the sharpest points to add a bit more definition and really make the details stand out. You could apply this as a spot highlight, like with the Wild Rider Red, but I find applying it as a really fine edge highlight really makes the black details pop out and adds definition to an area that can look quite flat. I'm just using the very tip of my brush to keep these lines as small as possible as I work my way around the black half of the uniform, adding this edge highlight. I'm also applying Mechanica Standard Grey to the knee pad, making sure some of the Eshen Grey is still visible. And with the uniform highlighted, the model's really coming together. So next I'm going to highlight the leather. For this I'm starting with Mournfang Brown again. Like with the red for the uniform, I'm applying this in areas that the shade didn't settle. Wherever the Agrax Earth shade settled in a recess, I'm leaving it there and painting either side with some Mournfang Brown. This brightens up these areas of leather while keeping all the definition we got from the shade. I'm making sure I pick out all of the creases and folds as well, leaving that shade in the recess, but brightening up all of the raised areas. For the belt, I'm doing much the same. Often the shade has settled towards the middle, so I'm brightening up the edges of the belt with some Mournfang Brown to keep that definition from the shade. With the bag, I'm leaving the shade in the recesses and around details. The shoes have quite a few small creases in them, so the shade has created that definition and shadow. I'm brightening up the areas that the shade didn't settle back up to a pure Mournfang Brown colour. For the gloves, I'm catching all of the details like folds and creases, as well as the fingers, but leaving that Agrax Earth shade showing in all the recesses of the gloves. The Mournfang Brown has brightened up those areas, but left all the definition from the shade. So now with some Scrag Brown, I'm going to apply an edge highlight. I'm applying this at the very edges of all of the leather details, leaving some of the Mournfang Brown showing, and just catching the very edge with a thin highlight of Scrag Brown. This will brighten up the edges and give the impression of slightly worn leather, and really make all of these details pop on the model. For the belts, I'm catching just the very edges with some Scrag Brown by leaving that Mournfang Brown showing as well. It creates a nice transition to the highlights so they don't appear too stark on the model. And with the bag, I'm just catching the very edges of the details, so the areas around the flap and the edges of the bag, just adding that definition with the edge highlight. With the boots, I'm catching the edges to the tops and the folds with a thin edge highlight of Mournfang Brown. And finally for the gloves, I'm applying a small highlight to all of the details, like the creases and the knuckles on the fingers, with some Scrag Brown. And with the brown highlighted, there are only a few details left to highlight on the model. The next of these is going to be the socks, and for this I'm using White Scar. And I'm catching all of the creases and the folds on the socks. With the Celestial Grey base coat and the Nuln Oil in the recesses, the White Scar works really well to make the socks read as a dirty white. The Celestial Grey adds a bit of definition, so it looks like the socks have been well used and possibly not washed. Very fitting for Blood Bowl. With the socks highlighted, all that's left now is to highlight the metal details on the lineman. With some Liberator Gold, I'm going to highlight the gold. I'm just applying a very thin edge highlight to all of the gold trinkets on the model, This will give the impression of light catching on these gold details. I'm also catching the latch to the bag with a highlight of Liberator Gold. With the gold picked out, the final highlight is going to be on all of the silver details. For this I'm using Stormhose Silver, and I'm just picking out the edges of all of the silver details. So this is things like the sharpest points of the fleur-de-lis on his knuckles, all of the buckles, catching these with a very small spot highlight of Stormhose Silver, being careful around all of the other details. And I'm applying an edge highlight to the shoulder pads and knee pad. I'm just catching the very edges of these details with a thin highlight of Stormhose Silver. And with those highlights applied, that is how to quickly and easily paint a Bretonnian lineman for the new edition of Blood Bowl. Let me know in the comments down below if you play Blood Bowl and if there are any other teams you would like to see me paint. But thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and happy painting!